What if the person who left you didn't actually move on? They just moved away from the only kind of love they couldn't understand at the time. And now life is quietly showing them something uncomfortable. You were not easy to replace. You were rare to experience. Because here is the question most people avoid asking. Why does someone only realize your value after distance, silence, and loss? And why do some connections return in the mind long after they end in reality? Stay with this, because the answer is not about them alone. It is about what emotional absence slowly reveals. Let's be honest for a moment. When they walked away, it wasn't because you were ordinary or because you lacked something important in your personality. It wasn't because you were easy to replace with someone else. And it also wasn't because you failed to meet some basic standard of love or value. The truth is more uncomfortable than that. They left because what you brought into the connection required emotional depth, attention, and presence. And depth is something that feels heavy for someone who has learned to survive by staying emotionally light and distant. At that moment, it may have felt like rejection, like you were not enough in some way. But what you were actually facing was not a lack of your value, but a mismatch in emotional capacity and willingness to stay present in something real and deep. After they left, it probably felt like rejection in its purest form. It likely felt like you were not enough, or that something about you pushed them away. In the quiet moments that followed, your mind may have started replaying conversations, analyzing tone, words, and pauses, trying to find the exact moment things shifted. You may have questioned your intensity, your emotions, and your way of loving. You might have even wondered if loving deeply was the mistake all along. This is the stage where pain turns inward and starts to question identity instead of just the situation. But what feels like personal failure in that moment is often just emotional misalignment between two different ways of handling closeness and vulnerability. What people rarely understand is that avoidant individuals do not necessarily run from those who are ordinary or emotionally flat. In many cases, they distance themselves from people who are emotionally real, present, and deeply engaged. Depth triggers something in them that feels overwhelming or hard to process, especially if they are not used to emotional closeness that requires openness and consistency. So instead of leaning into that depth, they create space. Over time, life tends to reveal this pattern back to them in subtle ways. Because emotional avoidance does not erase connection, it only delays its impact. And what is delayed often returns in reflection, memory, and emotional comparison later on. When someone like you exits their life, or when they are the ones who choose to step away, the silence that follows does not remain peaceful forever. At first, that silence can feel like relief or control. It can feel like distance has solved emotional pressure. But as time passes, silence begins to change its shape. It becomes less like freedom and more like absence. It starts to echo in small moments, in pauses between distractions, and in times when there is nothing external to focus on. These echoes are not loud at first, but they slowly build an awareness of what is no longer present in their emotional world. This process is not about revenge, punishment, or proving a point. It is not about hoping someone regrets their choice in a dramatic way. It is about recognizing a psychological pattern that often repeats itself in emotionally avoidant individuals. Many of them do not return because they suddenly transform or become completely different people overnight. Instead, they often return because life gradually shows them that what they left behind carried a level of emotional depth that is not easily replaced. And when that realization forms, it usually does not come in a soft or gentle way, but through comparison, emptiness, and reflection over time. Right after separation, they may appear calm, composed, and even unaffected by what has happened. On the outside, they might seem lighter, as if nothing emotional is weighing them down at all. This is often interpreted as strength or clarity, but in many cases, it is simply the initial stage of emotional detachment, where the nervous system feels relieved from pressure. There are no emotional demands, no deep conversations, no vulnerability required. For a while, this feels like stability. But stability built on avoidance is not the same as emotional peace. It is simply the absence of emotional challenge, not the presence of true fulfillment or connection.
While you were sitting with emotional pain, processing loss in real time, and feeling every part of it deeply, they were sitting in a form of temporary quiet. That quiet can easily be mistaken for peace, especially when emotional intensity is no longer present. In that space, they may tell themselves that things are easier now, less complicated, and less demanding. They might even convince themselves that emotional closeness was too overwhelming or too intense to maintain. But what they are experiencing is not true peace. It is emotional numbing, where absence of pressure is misread as emotional well-being. Relief and happiness are not the same thing, even though they can feel similar in the beginning. Relief comes when emotional pressure disappears, when there are no expectations, no vulnerability, and no need to respond deeply to another person. Happiness, on the other hand, comes from connection, understanding, and emotional presence. One is about what is removed, and the other is about what is present. In the early stages after separation, avoidant individuals often confuse the two. They believe that feeling lighter means they made the right decision, when, in reality, they are only experiencing the absence of emotional depth they once had. As time moves forward, the initial relief slowly starts to change. Distractions begin to lose their impact, and the constant need to stay busy does not fully silence internal experience. What once felt like freedom gradually begins to feel like emotional space without meaning. This is where emotional emptiness starts to appear in subtle ways. It is not sudden or dramatic, but it grows quietly. Moments that were once filled with avoidance now become moments where thoughts begin to surface, especially memories connected to deeper emotional experiences that were previously pushed aside. This is where the fantasy phase often begins to develop. Avoidant individuals tend to idealize what they do not currently have access to. When they are in a relationship, they may fantasize about independence and emotional space. But when they are alone, they may begin to imagine a connection that feels easier, softer, or more compatible. They may tell themselves that maybe it was not emotional avoidance, but simply the wrong person or the wrong situation. On the surface, this explanation feels logical and comforting because it reduces inner conflict and responsibility. But underneath that reasoning lies a deeper misunderstanding. Emotional avoidance often confuses depth with difficulty. When emotions become strong or real, they are sometimes labeled as pressure instead of connection. Vulnerability is interpreted as intensity that needs to be escaped from. So in response, the mind begins searching for something simpler, something that does not trigger emotional defenses. For a short time, lighter interactions and surface-level connections may feel safer and easier to manage. But ease alone does not create emotional fulfillment or lasting satisfaction in relationships. Your emotional awareness, your depth, your consistency, and your ability to understand what is not directly spoken all become part of what made the connection feel real and unforgettable. You were not just someone who was present physically or casually involved. You were emotionally engaged, intentional, and invested in a way that created meaning. When someone experiences that kind of emotional presence,
and then shifts into something more superficial, the difference does not appear immediately. It reveals itself slowly over time as emotional contrast becomes more noticeable. This is when quiet comparison begins to form internally, even if it is not openly acknowledged.
They may not say it directly or even fully realize it at first, but new experiences often start to be measured against what they once had with you. The way you understood them without long explanations, the way you stayed consistent, and the way conversations felt alive rather than empty all become reference points. Ironically, the very qualities they may have once found overwhelming begin to stand out as something rare when compared to less emotionally deep interactions. Eventually, what is missing becomes harder to ignore, even if it cannot be clearly named at first. There may still be attraction or surface enjoyment in new experiences, but something essential feels absent. There might be connection without safety or interaction without depth. These surface-level experiences can entertain the mind, but they do not fully satisfy emotional needs over time. Human beings naturally seek meaning and emotional resonance, even those who tend to avoid it. The resistance is often stronger than the need, but the need does not disappear. As time continues, memories begin to return in fragments rather than full experiences. A song, a quiet moment at night, a stressful day, or an emotional situation can trigger sudden recollections of how it felt to be understood in a deeper way. These fragments do not come all at once, but they slowly weaken the narrative that leaving was completely easier or better. Each memory brings back a piece of emotional reality that was previously set aside or minimized in order to maintain distance and control. Eventually, emotional emptiness becomes more noticeable in subtle but persistent ways. It is rarely expressed openly by avoidant individuals because they tend to process it internally rather than share it. Instead of confronting it directly, they often stay busy, distracted, or engaged in external activities. But emotional experiences always leave traces behind. Over time, those traces accumulate, and what was once avoided begins to surface in quiet reflection, comparison, and moments of unexpected emotional awareness. When you have experienced someone who genuinely saw you, shallow connections begin to feel thinner and less meaningful. Conversations start to feel repetitive, like the same ideas are being recycled without any real depth behind them. Emotional support begins to feel inconsistent, almost unpredictable, as if it appears only when it is convenient. Even laughter, which once felt natural and effortless, does not land in the same way anymore. Slowly, a quiet realization starts forming in the background of your awareness. What they had with you was not ordinary, and more importantly, you were not ordinary in the way you showed up emotionally, mentally, and personally in that connection. Your emotional intelligence, your ability to stay present during difficult moments, your loyalty when things became uncertain, your willingness to grow instead of running, and your authenticity in expressing what you felt. These are not loud traits that demand attention immediately. They are quiet strengths, but they are powerful and rare. In a world where emotional reactions are often shallow or inconsistent, your way of being creates contrast. And when someone loses access to that kind of presence, life eventually starts revealing that difference in very clear but gradual ways through experience, reflection, and emotional comparison over time. It often appears first in stressful situations where no one responds the way you once did. It shows up in moments where communication feels flat, where understanding is missing, and where emotional support feels surface level. It becomes noticeable in conflicts where instead of resolution, there is confusion or avoidance. Even silence begins to feel heavier than expected, because it no longer carries the comfort of being understood. These small experiences slowly begin to accumulate, and without even realizing it,
Internal shifts start forming in the background of their mind and emotions. This is not a sudden change. It does not happen in one moment or one realization. Instead, it develops gradually, almost quietly, as different experiences begin to contrast with what they once had with you. Over time, the internal story starts to shift. What once sounded like, "I needed space," slowly transforms into a softer, more uncertain thought like, "Maybe I lost something meaningful." And once that kind of thought enters the mind, it rarely disappears completely. It stays, returns, and deepens through reflection. Because regret does not arrive loudly or dramatically. It builds slowly through memory, contrast, and emotional comparison. It appears when new experiences fail to match old emotional depth.
It appears in quiet moments when distractions are no longer strong enough to keep thoughts away. And it appears in reflection when the mind begins to reevaluate what was once taken for granted. This is why understanding your value is not about waiting for recognition, but about recognizing that depth is not always understood in real time. True rarity is often misunderstood in the moment it is experienced. You are emotionally present in a world that often rewards emotional distance. You are consistent in a time where inconsistency is normalized. You invest depth in a culture that frequently avoids it. And because of that combination, your presence stands out even if it was not fully acknowledged when it was available. Rarity is not always celebrated immediately. Sometimes it is only recognized in absence. So if there has ever been confusion about why someone who once seemed close could walk away so easily, it is important to understand this clearly. Outward emotional ease does not always reflect internal emotional ease. Many avoidant individuals appear calm and unaffected on the outside, while internally experiencing suppressed emotion, confusion, or avoidance. Just because emotional processing is delayed does not mean it does not exist. In fact, in many cases, emotional understanding happens later rather than immediately. Avoidant patterns often follow a reversed emotional timeline. First comes relief, then comes emotional awareness. At the beginning, distance feels like control, and independence feels like safety. There are no emotional demands, no vulnerability required, and no need to face emotional intensity. For a short period, this feels manageable and even empowering. But over time, relief begins to lose its emotional weight. What once felt like freedom slowly starts to feel like emotional emptiness. While you were processing loss in real time, they were experiencing a form of emotional silence. And silence is often misinterpreted as peace. In that state, it becomes easy to convince oneself that things are simpler, easier, and less emotionally demanding without the connection. Emotional closeness may start to be labeled as pressure, and vulnerability may be reframed as something overwhelming. But what is actually happening is emotional numbing, not emotional resolution. Relief is not the same as happiness. Relief comes from the removal of pressure, while happiness comes from emotional presence, connection, and meaning. One is absence, the other is presence. And over time, the difference between the two becomes more noticeable, especially when distractions begin to fade and emotional quiet becomes more consistent. As time moves forward, that quiet begins to change shape. It becomes less about peace and more about emptiness. Distractions lose their intensity, and the mind begins to revisit thoughts that were previously pushed aside. This is where comparison begins, often silently. New experiences start to be measured against past emotional depth, even without conscious awareness. At first, this comparison is not direct or obvious.
It appears in small emotional contrasts. A conversation that feels shallow, a moment of stress where understanding is missing, a silence that feels uncomfortable instead of safe. And slowly, without realizing it, the mind begins to revisit emotional memories that once felt overwhelming but were actually meaningful in depth. Your emotional presence begins to stand out in memory, not as something exaggerated, but as something real and consistent. The way you understood without explanation, the way you stayed emotionally steady, the way you cared without hesitation. All of these qualities begin to reappear in reflection. And what once may have been labeled as too much starts to look like emotional depth that is not easily found again. This is where delayed emotional processing begins to unfold. While you were going through emotional pain directly and consciously, they were postponing theirs. Many avoidant individuals place emotional experiences into mental delay, telling themselves they will deal with it later. But emotions do not disappear simply because they are delayed. They remain stored until something triggers their return. When they eventually resurface, it is rarely gentle. It often comes in waves, triggered by silence, boredom, or the fading of distractions. At that point, emotional reflection becomes unavoidable. They begin to feel absence more clearly, not just as the absence of a person, but as the absence of emotional understanding and familiarity. The timing difference between your healing and their realization creates a major emotional contrast. By the time they begin to process loss, you have already moved through the hardest stages. You have already faced confusion, emotional pain, and internal questioning. You have already started rebuilding your emotional identity without their presence. This difference in timing is significant. It means that while they are just beginning to feel emotional weight, you are already stepping into clarity. Growth does not happen equally on both sides. It moves in different phases, and often the one who faced the pain directly reaches understanding earlier. As they slowly reflect, the story they once told themselves starts to weaken. What once felt like relief begins to feel incomplete, almost hollow in hindsight. Everyday life begins revealing small emotional gaps that were not noticeable before. No one notices emotional shifts the way you did. No one responds with the same level of understanding or silent awareness. Even what they once labeled as pressure starts to look like emotional care when seen from a distance. Perspective quietly reshapes memory, turning what once felt intense into something meaningful now that it is gone. At the same time, your absence becomes more noticeable. When you stop reaching out and stop explaining yourself, space opens for realization. Constant access often hides value, but distance reveals it. Curiosity begins to grow, questions start forming, and uncertainty replaces assumption. Your silence is not emptiness, it is growth. While they sit with absence and reflection, you are moving through healing and rebuilding. Over time, they begin to understand that what they had with you was not easily replaceable, and that realization slowly shifts into regret, even if it remains unspoken. In the end, what matters most is not who comes back or who finally understands, but what you have learned through everything you experienced. Time has a quiet way of revealing clarity. It shows you what was real, what was inconsistent, and what could not be sustained. And through that process, you begin to understand that emotional depth is not something you should ever have to reduce or question in yourself. It either meets you in return, or it does not belong in your life in the first place. So whatever happens next, the focus remains on your own stability, growth, and peace. People may come and go, and realizations may arrive late, but your direction does not need to shift with them. What you build within yourself, The awareness, the boundaries, and the understanding of your own value becomes the only thing that stays consistent. And from that place, you no longer wait for clarity from others, because you have already developed it within yourself.